Welcome back to Joe Stunner Boxing. I thought we'd end the weekend with something a little bit different. One of my subscribers, Callum. Hello, Callum. This one's for you because he suggested I do a little video on Tommy Morrison, who I assume is one of his favourite heavyweights of yesteryear. And Tommy Morrison was, without question, a very, very exciting fighter. He was a heavyweight in the 1990s. He turned pro in 1988. He had a very, very tragic backstory, which we'll go into in a minute. He was born in 1969, January, and he died in September of 2013. And he was 44 years old. He died of AIDS. But we'll get to that in a moment. He did live quite a chaotic life. By the time he was 19, he had 2 kids. So I wasn't messing around there. Wasn't holding the horses in the bedroom, was he? And then at one point he was married. I can't remember what part of his life, but he was married to 2 women at the same time. And weirdly enough, they were both called Dawn. So he liked women with the Christian name Dawn. But he weren't too good at avoiding that bigamy thing, that pesky bigamy thing. And he was married to them both at the same time. He was very, very popular because he was also very photogenic. He had this physique that looked like he was carved from marble. How he got that physique is questionable and may have contributed to him contracting HIV later in his life and ultimately AIDS. I'll go into that in a bit more detail later on. But it was thought that he was taking steroids and injecting them, and dirty needles could have been come into play, although he did like the ladies, so he was shagging around a bit. Could have been that. But anyway, he also, because he was a blonde, big, powerful guy, he was early on in his career, it was handled by Bill Caton, his career. Bill Caton, of course, famous for being one of Mike Tyson's managers very early on, along with Castamato was in the mix, and the other guy whose name, oh God, as you get older, you forget these fucking names that you've known all your life. Jim Jacobs. But Bill Caton, Jim Jacobs had died by that point. He'd been dead for quite a few years. Bill Caton took Tommy Morrison under his wing and kind of promoted him as a sort of white Mike Tyson. Because I remember Morrison, I followed his whole career, virtually his whole career. And he was being promoted as a huge, punching, ferocious guy, explosive. And he was like that. He loved the hooks, especially the left hook. Didn't do a lot of jab. He did jab, actually, but it was like, they were almost like, oh, I'm going to jab to set up my hooks. And you knew what was coming. I mean, he would fight a sort of very similar, apart from one fight, which we'll get to later, most of the time he was coming in strong with the hooks, lots of uppercuts, and, he just wanted to kill you. He just wanted to get you out of there. And his record, when he turned professional in 1988, kind of indicated that. Because he was fighting guys who were very familiar names, journeymen who would sort of turn up and get knocked out. People like Lorenzo Boyd. Lorenzo Boyd, the first time I saw him was when he was a one-round victim of Mike Tyson. He lasted into the second round against Tommy Morrison. He fought Steve Zuski, won a 4-round decision over him. People like Rick Ennis, Jesse Shelby, Dave Jacko fought him. He also fought Mike Tyson, Dave Jacko. But basically they were giving him soft touches, and then they threw in a few names. By the time we got to 1990, 1991, they were giving him fighters who were shot to bits but were named fighters. So he actually fought James Tillis and Pinklon Thomas back-to-back. He stopped Tillis in the first round, 3 knockdowns, and Pinklon Thomas, he retired after 1 round. At the time, I think Thomas was bang on drugs, if I remember rightly. But yeah, he was just collecting paychecks. But James Tillis and Pinklon Thomas have fought lots and lots of heavyweights. Thomas was a former champion. Tillis took Tyson the distance, 10-round distance, when Tyson was up and coming. He also fought Bruno, didn't he? Yeah. And Pinklon Thomas actually held a version of the world heavyweight title, but did have his issues outside of the ring. But they were both shot by the time that Tommy Morrison got his fists on them. And Bill Caton and Morrison's handlers steered him towards the lightly regarded WBO heavyweight title. And it was the fight that they eventually the matchup they eventually paired him with was against an undefeated Olympic gold medalist, Ray Mercer. Now, if you look at Morrison's record, leading up to that Mercer fight, I think 4 of his previous 5, or maybe 5 of his previous 6 fights had against lower level guys, including the 2 with Thomas and Tillis, had ended in the first round. So this was anything but the preparation to fight someone like Ray Mercer, whose main attribute, apart from the fact he was an Olympic gold medalist and could hit hard, and he had an incredible chin, incredibly hard chin. He was a tough, tough man. I think he was an ex-military man, good amateur, but you couldn't put a dent in him. Now, his chin got cracked later on in his career, last third of his career, last quarter of his career maybe. He was getting stopped. But when he fought Tommy Morrison, he was 17-0, and he was as hard gets. And Morrison began that fight with 1991 for the WBO heavyweight title. He began by putting it on Mercer from the word go, loading up with every single punch. He really shook Mercer. I mean, Mercer took some huge hooks and shuddered, but kind of, and looked a little bit shaken, but still kept coming forward, putting the heat on Morrison, draining him. And before you knew it, Morrison was knackered. And at the start of the 5th round, only about half a minute in, he got trapped on the ropes, and Ray Mercer scored one of the most frightening KOs you will ever see. If you've never seen it, Ray Mercer knocking out Tommy Morrison, it's got to be on YouTube, I'm sure it is. Go and have a look, because it's kind of terrifying what happens. He just obliterates him. Morrison's hanging on the ropes, and the referee is in way, way too late. So that was Morrison's first defeat, and it was a very shocking highlight reel type of knockout defeat. So he came back, fighting the usual guys. He fought a few that weren't too. I mean, he's fighting people like Kimuel Odom, his name was, and Jerry Halstead, and they were, C plus level fighters, maybe people like Art Tucker. He did fight a guy called Joe Hip, who I think was of Native American extraction, and Joe Hip took Morrison into the 9th, I think it was. And Morrison stopped him late, and I think Morrison injured himself. He had a busted shoulder or busted hand or something like that. Now, Morrison did have a great shootout. This was in 1993 against Carl Williams, a former world title challenger. Williams was actually a very, very good fighter. You'd call him sort of a B-level fighter, but he fought for the title. He got stopped in 1 round by Tyson. But he did give Larry Holmes 15 rounds to think about. 15 rounds to think about when he got outpointed by Holmes. And this was when Holmes had something left. Holmes, by that point, was still fighting, because he actually beat his kind of old-man Ray Mercer after Mercer had beaten Morrison and took that WBO heavyweight title. But Williams was a good fighter, and he had an up and downer with Morrison, where I think he was over in the 1st round and the 3rd round. I think Morrison was down twice in the 4th or 5th. I want to say the 5th, but it was an up and downer. And eventually Williams got stopped in 8 rounds. But that was a hellish fight. But it did show, again, the vulnerabilities of Tommy Morrison going on the floor twice against, Williams, who wasn't shot but had seen better days, put it that way. Nevertheless, that win set Morrison up for a fight with George Foreman for the vacant WBO heavyweight title. It had been vacated. They put Foreman together with Morrison. And this was the one fight that Morrison had where he didn't go straight after the guy. He must have thought, Big George, he's going to soak up my punishment just like Ray Mercer did. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to box him. And incredibly, I remember watching this fight and being stunned, because Morrison boxed, moved. Now, okay, George was really, really slow. I mean, slower than a mudslide. But Morrison was jabbing and moving, sliding, and, he was like, whoa. But if he'd done this against Mercer, maybe he could have beaten him. And he outpointed George. And George was George Foreman, big, tough guy, huge punch, great chin, but he could not, he just wasn't fast enough. He was so slow, so incredibly slow. And Morrison, just being a much, much younger man, zipped around him and buzzed around him like an annoying wasp and outpointed him. So he had this title. he had this WBO title, which at the time, the WBO was not considered to be at all prestigious. It was the poor man's heavyweight championship. No one really took it seriously. Kind of like the IBO now. Who is the IBO heavyweight champion now? You tell me. You can't, can you? Do you know what? I can't tell you either. It was probably Usyk. He's got all the belts. We'll say Usyk. I think it might be Usyk, actually. But anyway, Morrison at least had this WBO title. And there was a very strange fight after the Foreman fight, which is really quite a funny tale because Morrison, I can't remember who he was due to fight. This was in Kansas City. Morrison was from Arkansas. And I can't remember who he was meant to fight. But anyway, the guy dropped out at the 11th hour. And there was a fighter called Tim Tomaszek who came in with a 35-10 record at the time. He had 35 wins, 10 defeats. And he was there to watch the fight. And he was in the crowd, drinking a beer or whatever with his friends or his missus or whatever. And they had no fighter. So the promoter said to Tomaszek, "Do you want to fight for the WBO heavyweight title?" He was like, "Yeah, hold my beer." And they gave him a pair of fucking trunks. I don't think he even had a pair of boots on. Here's a pair of flip-flops, use those, And the guy went 4 rounds with Tommy Morrison. Messed him around for 4 rounds, but fought for the world title. Strangest story that I've ever heard, one of them anyway, regarding the heavyweight title. And yeah, he sort of retired after 4 rounds because he was knackered. I mean, he's only there to watch the fight and have a beer and a hot dog. Next thing you know, he's got a pair of gloves on and he's in the ring swapping punches. But yeah, that was the first rather strange defence of the WBO title from Morrison. But then he fought a guy called Michael Bent. And Michael Bent was a former Olympian who had 1 defeat on his record, 10 wins, 1 defeat. And he had been flattened by, I can't even remember the name of the guy. It was someone like a Kimule Oden sort of figure. Probably wasn't Kimule Oden. But he'd been knocked out anyway in 1 round. And his career, even though he turned pro with a little bit of, I think he'd been knocked out by Ray Mercer in the amateurs, if I remember rightly. But he was considered to be kind of in no man's land as far as his professional career was concerned. But they put him in with Morrison. He had a 10-1 record, former Olympian, former decent amateur. Yeah, I'll fight him. And Morrison, I don't think there's any doubt he was looking beyond that, because had he beaten Michael Bent, he would have fought Lennox Lewis for, I think the purse was $6 million. Which was a lot of money back then. Now, of course, nothing, is it? $6 million. Who cares about that? But back then, 1993, it was a lot of money. But he got chinned in a round. Morrison hurt Bent early on, as soon as the fight started, and then pinned him on the ropes, and Bent countered, because Bent could bang a bit. He was a hard hitter. He caught Morrison, knocked him down, and then stopped him in the first round. And the $6 million fight with Lennox Lewis went out the window for Tommy Morrison, whereas Michael Bent had 1 more fight against Herbie Hyde in London and made a lot of money, and then retired. He was knocked out badly by Hyde and retired after that with an 11-2 record. But Morrison, of course, backed down. It's like snakes and ladders. You work your way up and then you get eaten by the snake and down you go, down to the start again. He had to start again. And he didn't look that great because he got a draw with a guy called Ross Purity, who was a very good journeyman type. But Morrison, I mean, he was down in a couple of times in that fight, 6th or 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th. But the second half of the fight, he was on the floor a couple of times. And Purity, he shouldn't have been that shouldn't have been the case with Morrison. He looked terrible. He should be beating Ross Purity as honest a fighter as Ross Purity is. And he got taken 7 rounds by a guy called Terry Anderson. Was it Terry Anderson got done by George Foreman in a round at Wembley? I seem to remember that. It might have been him. But then Morrison fights Donovan Razor Ruddock, who himself is looking to come back. And this was an incredible fight. One of the best heavyweight fights of the 90s. We're up to 1995 now. So slap bang in the middle of the decade. Morrison fights Ruddock. And they're both on the floor. But there is one knockdown that Morrison scores. It's an enormous left hook. And it lifts Ruddock off the canvas, and he slaps him down on his back, and then Ruddock, you think that's it, it's all over. Ruddock gets up. He gets up. And in fact, eventually, was it that fight I'm thinking of, or was it the Carl Williams one? I think it's the Ruddock fight, because I always get those two mixed up because there were lots of knockdowns in both of them. But Ruddock gets up, and eventually he gets stopped in the 6th round. But what a fight. Go and have a look at that fight. Tommy Morrison versus Razor Ruddock. Unbelievable. And then, after that, he finally gets a fight against Lennox Lewis, probably not for $6 million. Again, 1995 we're talking. And that he got stopped by Lennox in 6, and he was on the floor. Lennox had him on the floor. No shame in that, you know. Now, after that fight, Tommy Morrison he failed an HIV test, and he was told, you have got the HIV virus. Right? Prior to this, even if he'd had little bumps in the road as far as his professional boxing career was concerned, he was making money outside the ring. He was in one of the Rocky movies, Rocky V, which Sylvester Stallone says is by far the worst Rocky movie. But it's he played Tommy Gunn, a protege of Rocky's, who gets lured away by a guy who was so obviously meant to be Don King. I can't remember the guy's name in the movie. And it ends up with a street fight between Rocky and Tommy Gunn, and it's a bit silly, but it's a Rocky movie, so you've got to allow for a bit of artistic license, or whatever they call it. Willing suspension of disbelief. Don't want anyone staring in disbelief at my willy suspension, but anyway, that's another matter. But anyway, he got out of the ring. He got diagnosed with HIV, right? And he denied he had it. And for the rest of his life, he was insistent, absolutely adamant, that he did not have the HIV virus, and he did not take any medication to control the virus. He even had 3 fights after being diagnosed with HIV. One of them was against a guy called Marcus Rode, who he knocked out in a round. Marcus Rode was, at one point, pretty decent journeyman type. But he had a couple of other fights that were meaningless in obscure places. And yeah, then his career just petered out, and he disappeared because he wasn't taking any medication for his HIV status. He didn't even think he had it. He developed AIDS and died at the age of 44. Very, very sad, like a skin and bone. Very, very sad case. And his mother, and I think his wife at the time, I can't remember her name, they said he had full-blown AIDS, but he wasn't aware of it. He was like, no, it's a false diagnosis. I haven't got AIDS. I haven't got HIV. What are you talking about? And he died. He was in Nebraska, Omaha, Nebraska, and passed away. It's a horrible way to go. Multi-organ failure. Yeah. So that is the tragic story of Tommy Morrison, who flew very, very high and shone very, very brightly early on in his life, or very briefly, and then disintegrated, almost like Icarus flying close to the sun and burning up. Yeah, you live that life. That's the way it goes. But that's the story of Tommy Morrison. I don't know. Have I included everything? I think I've probably included the main points. But if you know anything about Tommy that I haven't mentioned, please leave it in the comments below. I hope you did enjoy the video. If you're like me, the age that I am, you will remember Tommy Morrison has been very, very exciting. And if you're a younger boxing fan, go and have a look at his fights on YouTube, especially the Ruddock one and the Carl Williams one. Oh, and the Mercer one. Those are great, great fun. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Comments below, and please subscribe to the channel if you're new, and hit the like button if you like the video, because you want to build the channel up with me, don't you? Of course you do. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much indeed, and bye for now.